One of the things that I'm often accused of is generational pride of being a Gen Xer. And I know that not every millennial likes us. Some of the senior millennials, I guess, can stand us because technically my baby sister's technically a senior millennial. I think Gen Zs and Gen Alphas, they just don't understand us at all, nor do our boomer parents. I don't think our boomer parents do. I think that our perspective is extremely unique. And today on No Way Out, it's not just the two Gen Xers that are normally here, me and Ponch, but we have Max Borders, who writes a Substack that we highly recommend from the world of reorientation, and that's Underthrow. And Max is a fellow Gen Xer, and we're going to start with the topic decline. Max, how does that suit you?
Well, it sounds fun. There's nothing more fun than talking about the imminent demise of the American Republic and our economic good health
Well,
to start the day, right?
yeah, you're preaching to the choir here. It's interesting. I think the thing about our generation that really recognizes the decline is because we've straddled both the analog and the digital worlds, probably with better cognizance and memory and capability to assume digital than, say, our boomer predecessors. And I think for whatever reason, it just seems like the slip, the decline, everybody feels it. I think that we're really good at detecting it and talking about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Think we are well positioned in this sort of liminal area. Now, of course, when our kids and their kids come online and sort of take the torch, and I see it as a torch passing. That's why I feel much more like we have a responsibility to reach these and bond with this generation, rather than just being observers of the liminality. And that's nothing against Boyd, with OODA. We have to reorient and help them become reoriented, which is a more of an intergenerational and slow process of mentorship. And I think I'm not laying our decline at the feet of this generation. I think the way that this generation expresses itself and shows up in the world is symptomatic of some things that have gone wrong. But I don't want to skip too far ahead because there's so many ways that we can talk about decline. Apparently every man likes to talk about Rome. And of course, Rome's decline was through debasement of the currency, the bread and circuses for the people, and this sort of patrician class that became sort of lazy and weak, and really more and more in the sort of slave master dynamic became its undoing in a lot of ways. And I think we are seeing sort of echoes of that in our society, where we have this victim culture that has become so pervasive, and the idea of a man of strength and character and so on has been washed away in it. But there are economic factors too. So it all depends on where you want to start, really.
Yeah, it seems like, I mean, that's not a bad place to start. It seems like what we aspired to when we were kids and we're watching TV shows that had authority figures. There was a there was a Cliff Huxtable. Well, I guess we know how that story has developed.
I wouldn't go there.
No, not Cliff Huxtable. All right. Well, as I said, yeah, I guess we know how that story went in a different direction. But
He
like,
played a virtuous man on television. That's for sure.
yeah,
There you
or
go.
we'd
People looked
watch
up to him.
we'd watch the reruns of Andy Griffith, or we'd watch the reruns of Leave It to Beaver and things like that. And there was a family unit. And then my buddy's dad used to always say, "Well, it's all Norman Lear's fault with All in the Family," and he tried to make a lampoon out of the sort of father figure type holding everything together, which I guess backfired because turns out people actually liked Archie Bunker and Alex P. Keaton and other characters designed um, to
To
denigrate.
be a
But
caricature of something, yeah.
yeah, but it seems that also too, like, what are people have things flipped so much that there are no things that I don't know if we should just limit it to men, but even women. I mean, that aspirational things are the things that we want to aspire to. It seems that when we were kids in elementary school, it was a much different dynamic. And I don't think it's just the medium of electronic media and social networking and all that. I think that there was something else going on.
Ooh, there's so much there, right? We can really just jump in and hang on. I think there is a gendered forgive the term, gender dimension to all of these social movements. And in fact, it's a little bit reductionist, but I do that for the purpose of understanding, right? So we can say more or less over the years, at least in our lifetimes, to the extent that politics is healthy, and it's really hard for me and my kind of person to describe politics as healthy. It tends to engender animus and set people against each other. It's a zero sum game and so on. We can talk about those dynamics as a feature of our decline in a minute. But in terms of just archetypes, Jungian archetypes, if you like, we can think of the Democratic Party as the mommy party, the Republican Party as the daddy party. Mommy and daddy party fights a lot, and over the years they fought over, control of this great family structure that we call America. And in the process, that has become so acrimonious and so much distant, so much of a chasm between the two, that what we have now are these sort of destructive archetypes for each emerging. So between 2014 and 2024, we saw the re-emergence, because I lived through the early 90s when political correctness was first around, and so obviously did you guys. So we saw the pre-echoes of the social justice fundamentalism, if you like, that happened between 2014 and 2024 when it was at its peak. And that came to be called, and it almost like makes me want to gag to utter it, but people know it as woke. Okay. With that, wokeness strikes me as being, until it gets to the most authoritarian or totalitarian degree, it strikes me as that is an instantiation of the devouring mother archetype. Okay. So it's like, everybody who's not a certain type of person is a victim. And you get this victimizer, victimhood, or you get this oppressor and oppressed, which is a recapitulation of Marxism in a way, although done through culture and other means. And that is, of course, by design. But that movement and all it brought with it, I believe, and I think there's a woman who has a really good article on this recently. I think it's Ellen Andrews is her name, had a great article about this called the Great Feminization, and she argues, and I agreed with it absolutely in really strong terms, that the social justice fundamentalism movement was a kind of devouring mother archetype. Always felt that way. And then everybody sort of got fed up with that. They got fed up with all the sort of really base egalitarianism. It's like it's no longer equality of opportunity, it's equality of outcome. Positions and offices need to be allocated by, something other than whether or not you can do the job well, standards, meritocracy, and so on. All of those things started to really niggle at people. They knew something was wrong in a fundamental way, and I think that awakened the daddy archetype. The problem is that the daddy archetype has its own pathology, which is the tyrannical father. And if we're not careful, sort of the kind of, we're seeing a spillover into this tyrannical father archetype with a lot of this national conservatism. So instead of sort of a reciprocal rule of law, people are, architects of their own destinies, and they collaborate together for the good of some mission or for the good of their communities. We started seeing we need to overcome them as an advancing army and march through the institutions just as they did, to turn them out on their ears and take over and impose a godly masculine order, right? That is something that is starting to happen in ways that I feel very uncomfortable with on the right. So the two negative archetypes of right and left, the devouring mother and the tyrannical father, are now emergent, and they're fighting over the same territory, which is not likely to build anything or leave anything in its wake than the architectures of authoritarian rule, the rheostats,
the road to serfdom.
the road to serfdom.
Yeah, so I published on that recently, and I can't recommend Hayek enough because John Boyd read him, specifically The Fatal Conceit, which was a influence on later versions of Patterns of Conflict. But The Road to Serfdom, there's a great cartoon version which I put in the article, which summarizes it well enough. I mean, I recommend that people read the book. The book, Hayek's not the easiest guy to read, but it's important. And I don't think it's just Hayek. I think that there's plenty of literature that points to this exact dynamic, whether it's Lord of the Rings or C.S. Lewis. I mean, there's plenty of writers that have written about this too. These same dynamics and these same patterns that it seems like the pendulum is going to swing to the opposite. Like we've gone from it's like revolution, counter revolution, revolution, counter revolution, or revolution reaction, whatever it is. It's never clean. It's never pretty. Somewhere, I guess, somewhere in it, I mean, I don't think we're in one now, but don't you think somewhere in it there's a golden age that everybody kind of misses? They don't know that they're in it until later, too late. Like, did you ever think that the '80s
Yeah.
were a golden age when you? I
I mean,
don't.
I honestly think that we're still living in the golden age,
Hmm.
and the fact that we have new generations who have come to take it for granted or who see it as somehow oppressive or wrong or something like that. Look, I understand that for a young person, a person in his or her 20s right now, it's really hard to get ahead. They were sold a bill of goods on the student loans, the FAFSA program that got developed in the late 80s, early 90s, and that was, probably we were the first generation who got sold that bill of goods, but it was reinforced and reinforced over the years. And as more of those student loans started massive subsidy program for higher education, it just became more and more expensive. It came more and more layered with administrivia and an administrative class. And so freighted, it became more and more expensive to where tuition inflation was unstoppable. And now we're in a situation where people, come out of university with $200,000. Of course, nobody wants to give them a mortgage, or much less a car loan. So they're struggling. But it's also that just things are more expensive across the board because of generalized inflation. So
Which is a
I
debasement
understand that.
of currency, as we had Frank Shostak come on our show recently.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, the more that Congress spends, the more there's, printing money to infinity in order to sort of compensate for it, which floods the market with dollars. And if anyone who's ever followed Milton Friedman believes him, that is, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. I think that there are things that can affect prices, such as energy prices and so on, and regulatory features. But at the end of the day, the biggest factor in inflation writ large is the money supply, and it's the way that powerful tax us without having to raise taxes.
And it happens to you constantly, and nobody understands because they take all these things for they take.
You can't save money because the value of your money is, your purchasing power is reduced, and you're not likely to make any kind of, because at the end of the day, when you bring down the interest rates and inflation is higher than the interest rate in real terms, you're not saving money, you're losing purchasing power over time.
Mhm.
So then you get generations like ours and the boomers who have been told by the system, we have to put everything into securities, unless you're a Bitcoiner or into crypto, which I am. But otherwise, most people in our generation are not. And what they do is that we either buy real property or we put everything into securities. And that has inflated a massive bubble. And that bubble
Yeah.
continues to be pumped up through monetary Keynesianism, and it will into perpetuity till it, well, let's not say in perpetuity, but that will be done until it's no longer sustainable. And I
Yeah.
don't think that we're very long for that sustainability. And that means our kids that basically millennials and Z and alpha stand to inherit a world that the boomers and the greatest generation created, that the Xers are doing nothing about right now except belly aching. And I'm sorry to say that, but they haven't. There are Xers in Congress who are belly aching about it, but they're not enough. They for some reason don't respond to the same incentives that the rest of Congress does, and so we spend and spend and spend.
Aren't
And
we the
by we,
smallest
I mean they.
generation? Aren't we the narrowest band, I think?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I think we were smaller. I'm not sure. I
Yeah.
think we were smaller a bit than the boomers. They were,
Yeah.
the greatest generation came back from the war, and they had a lot of babies.
Yeah, a lot of
That's
kids,
for
yeah.
sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
and the boomers were, family planning came online in 1961, I think it was. The birth control pill was introduced, and then by the 70s, there was more, the emergence of the independent woman.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, and 2 working parents and stuff like that, but I think there were fewer babies, but we weren't seeing the demographic collapse we're seeing now.
Do you
And
find
this is another thing that really troubles me about this generation that's coming online, that they're in their prime mating years, if you wanna call it that, is that they are not having kids, and it's
Yeah.
scary. We're gonna s you know
I always thought too that the working mother was always sold as, "Oh, this is an advancement of women's rights," but actually it's because the currency was so debased that you needed to have 2 incomes in a household or else you couldn't survive as a family.
I think that's right. 70 was the final decoupling of the dollar from the gold standard. Things went haywire after that in a lot of ways.
And then you explain that to people and they look at you like you're speaking in Klingon. Like you tell them about, I actually, for our paid subscribers, I put up all my sources that I put in to say, to teach somebody that, because I get this a lot. Well, like, where would you start? I said, well, the advantage that you have now, if you start, you go in the Mises Institute and you grab all these PDFs that are free and cost nothing, and you put them up in Google LM, and you build yourself a class to teach yourself about business cycle theory, to teach yourself about the mystery of banking or how the Federal Reserve works, and you understand what's actually going on, or watch the movie Zeitgeist, or the Zeitgeist 2 if you want a entertaining version versus an economic literature version. And then people look at you like, "Well, I've never heard this before." Like, no one ever taught me this before. Well, that doesn't mean it doesn't mean it's not valid. It doesn't mean it's not being used against you.
Yeah, and funny you mentioned Zeitgeist. I think that guy's a socialist, but he does a great job
Yeah.
of really setting out how the monetary system sort of pulls everything apart through time and makes people into debt slaves, essentially. I hate to use that kind of terminology because it can sometimes make people bristle. It's like, oh, I can't take this guy seriously because he's using that kind of language. But we have to be honest about these things. And when I say debt slave, there's a little bit of what could we call it? Hyperbole in that. We're not literally slaves, people who are in debt, but certainly there are massive pressures. You're kind of up against the wall financially, and more people are. I think not only are we in record debt in terms of sovereign debt, what the federal government holds in debt, and what we have to pay for as taxpayers through printing money just for debt service. There's also a problem with personal debt, private debt. I think that we're at record high levels right now. And as soon as one of those goes tits up, there's going to be a big cascading effect throughout the entire economy. And I fear it may take decades to recover from it.
So, Max, the past week, Mike Green, one of our friends who does a lot of work in investing, wrote something that says, the new poverty line is $140,000. He changed that. It's not necessarily a poverty line. It's just the amount of money you need to survive in a certain county. And that it's context specific, right? It changes based on where you are in the US. But he points out a lot of things we just said, and it's kind of controversial because people attack and say, well, that's not the poverty line. What's happening here is Mike is telling the world that it takes a lot of money to have a house, pay off debt, have a car, have 2 children, have 2 jobs, and just to get by, right? And yet people are attacking him saying this guy's completely lost his mind. That's not true whatsoever. Everything's great. But I just want to bring this up because I don't know if I think some of our listeners have been following this over the last week. Checking in with you. Have you seen this at all? You track any of this?
Can you say it one more time?
Yeah. So Mike Green identified that $140,000 is what he calls the poverty line. And I forgot
Yeah.
which county it is. It might be somewhere in New Jersey or something like that.
Mhm.
But he breaks it down and says, when you look at the cost of not just rent, but mortgages, insurance, healthcare, uh, cost of daycare, food, transportation, all that,
Mhm.
you need about $140,000 a year just to get by
Gotcha. For per household, right?
per household, right?
Yeah, yeah. That kinda makes sense. I don't know the empirics on it, but that rings true to me even where I am in the Carolinas, which is probably cheaper than, say, the Northeast
Yeah.
or West Coast, for
And I
example.
think he came under attack because of the number is like it's $136,000 is the real number he came up with for a certain area. But it's based on where you live too, right? So
Yeah.
it doesn't mean across the US you need $136,000 to survive as a household. In some places you do. The point is
Poverty
it's higher.
sounds a little bit, hyperbolic, just like debt slave may have, just because I think we'd still be the envy of the world. Any household making $136,000 is
Yes.
still the envy of about 90% of the world. So we should be under no illusions about that.
More than 90.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I don't wanna overstate it though. So I gave that conservative percentage. I think what he means by poverty is relative poverty, as in relative to the past, what it takes to have a decent standard of living to cover all the bases of the kinds of things you want to have covered. For example, being able to pay your taxes, being able to pay your bills on time, making sure you have health insurance, all of these things. And so many of them have been artificially inflated for various reasons. We know, for example, that energy costs were artificially inflated over the last 4 years until the most recent administration came in and said, okay, we're going to liberalize this industry again and not over regulate it so we can bring down those costs. And that has happened. Credit to the current administration, unless you're worried about that climate change is going to destroy the world in 12 years, which is now down to about 4 years, I think. But in any case, that 12-year figure's been cited so many times. I don't know which one to take seriously, but
I think it is 4 because when I think it was AOC that said that, right, in 2016.
okay, that
That
sounds about right. Yeah.
we're getting down. Yeah, of course, when we were kids, there were people telling us that we were going into an ice age, and when we were kids, there were people telling us we were all gonna be nuked in the year 1991, and there was, so we're still here.
We are, and look, one of the issues that I think is really that could be the linchpin of rapid decline is healthcare. That is one thing that we want people to be able to afford and have access to. Not only for compassionate reasons, like we want to know that everybody can go to the doctor and get healed and fixed if it's possible, right? And people can seek treatment. But also for we don't want those inevitable aspects of our lives to completely consume the the portion of our income that makes life worth living. You know what I mean? If we do get healed. So, for example, in what was it, 2009, we got the ACA, which was Obamacare. And everybody at the time who opposed Obamacare warned in vaguely Hayekian terms, but in certainly in understanding of market prices, that you were going to get what is called a death spiral from this. And specifically, if you're going to charge what is known as community rating, older, sicker people the same price as you do young people, then you're going to have a really, really bad market distortion. And that market distortion is going to cause inflation. Couple that with the sort of third party payer effects, the expense account effects of nobody goes in and actually price shops. Everybody goes, what's my copay? We don't see that even though you paid $50 for that blood lab work, the rest of that $450 went onto the risk pool, and that aggregates, making premiums higher and higher and higher for people. When you start to, it's just like you were talking about earlier. When you start trying to explain this kind of stuff to people about healthcare, it looks like you're speaking Klingon.
We know
So
exactly how you feel about that. Everything
yeah,
I mean,
And
speaking
so
of Klingon, you brought up a liminal. You know, you talked about woke. Mark brought up the brief from earlier about the anatomy of a decline and all that. But it is hard to get through people who jobs or livelihood depends on them not seeing these things, right? It's easy to throttle back and just be a recipient of the system than it is to be a participant of it.
that's right. It's the economists call it rational irrationality or rational ignorance. Let's just go with rational ignorance. You don't have a strong incentive. No individual person has a strong incentive to understand the dynamics of the healthcare system. They do have a direct and very strong incentive to realize how much their copay is, right? So to understand at a complex or complicated is a better term. If you're into complexity science, there's a distinction there. Complicated healthcare system, there's very little incentive for you to understand it and understand it correctly. However, what you as an individual pay and what you receive from that having paid that, you have a very strong incentive. So people can tell you the in and outs of their convoluted health plans, but they can't tell you and give you a macro picture of why this thing is coming apart. And so you get exactly what people like me were saying back then when Obamacare passed is that you're going to see a death spiral, which means you're going to have to continuously subsidize the ACA exchange with taxpayer money to paper over the fact that it's becoming more and more expensive and the system is coming apart. So now that they've stopped subsidizing it, which they did in earnest during COVID, what's happened? People are starting to bellyache about how the Trump administration isn't subsidizing their healthcare plans. So it's doubled. Well, this is where people need to get the sticker shock in order to necessitate change. It's really hard though, because because who benefits? Key bono, right?
Yeah.
We know the big pharma benefits, we know the insurers benefit, and everybody blames the insurers. Nobody blames the care providers, but the doctors and the hospitals are making bank.
Yeah.
They're making 10 to 15% profit margin on all their activities, whereas the insurers are only making 2 to 3%. There's a
There's
vast
not
difference there, and everybody blames the insurers for trying to dial it back, but it's all a feature of a shitty system, excuse me.
I think it was PJ O'Rourke who says if you think healthcare is expensive now, wait till it's free.
Oh, yeah.
Well, exactly.
And the economic lesson is that anything subsidized automatically pushes everybody's prices up. You know, my first job for 15 months before I went to the asset management world, I was in medical sales, and worked for a diagnostic pathology lab. You know, we would sell our laboratory services for biopsies. So, like, if you got a prostate biopsy or a gastrointestinal biopsy or dermatology biopsy, whatever it is, they'd send in the specimens and our pathologists would look at them. Well, I remember when I was in training, the vice president of sales handed me a box with 6 little jars in it for a sextant prostate biopsy. He goes, "That's $1,200 right there for the company." Well, why was it $1,200? Because that's the Medicare rate for a 6 jar uh, uh, prostate biopsy. He's like, and if you get 12, you get twice the much. It's $2,400. Well, that's because that's what Medicare is willing to pay for that. What's remarkable is that if I don't have Medicare and I'm young and I need to get a prostate biopsy, I have to pay that price. Why? Because that's the floor that the government set. The government set the floor at $1,200 because why would I care for somebody and lower their price if they were below the Medicare rate? I'm going to use what the government's going to pay me as the baseline. That's the floor, and everything has to be above that. So what happens to everybody else's costs?
This is such a great point that you make, and I almost feel like we have to have these kind of conversations like you're having rather than trying to paint a big macro picture. So when you use the medical device example and I use the blood test device example, device or blood test rather, what we're doing is we're pointing to the fact that all of the price system in healthcare has essentially been destroyed. The only things that don't fall under the third-party payer dragnet, which is heavily regulated and heavily distorted, and the prices are just completely out of whack. They're not rational at all. They're made based on whether it's the arbitrariness of Medicare payouts or the arbitrariness of some other regulatory phenomenon like community rating, and the fact that we use healthcare buffet cards instead of our own bank account cards. We get massive distortions. They can inflate everything away, and then the insurers have to negotiate, but they're really part of a vast cartel, right? A cartel that I call the cartel, because they're all in a sense in collusion. They know that there is a lot of profit in all of this distortion, and they share the spoils among themselves. And we are just functioning within an incentive system that permits that to happen. And then we come back and look at the healthcare premiums, and then we bellyache and wish that they could be changed. But who do you think is sitting down there with all these politicians in Washington on K Street? It ain't you and me. It's Blue Cross Blue Shield. It's, the hospital conglomerate. It's the big pharma guys. All of these kind of phenomena keep the system as it is in place and keep us paying high prices. Whereas if we could reintroduce, a la Hayek, a la Ludwig von Mises, a rational price system back into it that was competitive and transparent, we would see vast changes in our behaviors and a bringing down of the prices. We don't see that. So here we are. We're stuck with this shitty system. And now the very people who gave us Obamacare and its death spiral that we're living through now want to give us Medicare for all.
Hey, Max, you alluded to the difference between complex and complicated. I think that's really germane to this conversation, because at the end of the day, if you understand the difference between those domains, if you will, you can start to realize what's going on. So let's go back and look at complexity, or the complex domain, which is the domain where the relationship between cause and effect is only known in retrospect. And you get concepts such as of emergent self-organization in there. It's really about the system. If those who understand complexity theory can actually drive the system through amplification and dampening, putting probes into that system that drive behaviors. That's called leadership and or manipulation, depending on how you want to look at it, right? We get propaganda out of that as well. On the complicated side is a little bit different. That's just a jet is a complicated system. You put a human in it, it's a complex system. So fundamentally, and you write about this in your book too, or one of your books, about complex adaptive systems. Understanding this, we don't learn this in school, by the way, right? I didn't learn this in an MBA. Maybe they brought it up as wicked problems in joint professional military education and things like that. But what John Boyd was looking at in his favorite book happens to be about the complex adaptive systems in biology. That's where, one of the key reasons we talk about John Boyd's work is it helps you understand the difference between a complex system and a complicated system, as does the Cynefin framework. And I think you might be familiar with that based on the way you write. So can you take us through that a little bit deeper based on the conversation we just had about healthcare? Kind of,
marrying the two, that's going to be particularly challenging, but let me give it a shot.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things that I think the reason that Boyd, and you guys are the experts on Boyd, so you can throw tomatoes at the screen if I start to go amiss. I know you'll remind me where I go wrong, but I think
we send men in black ski masks and black vans. Just kidding.
Maybe I shouldn't talk about Boyd then, but Boyd strikes me, if you had to just strip it down to compare, you can see why Boyd was enamored of Hayek, first of all, because Hayek is really playing in a space where he's starting to grok the ideas of complex systems in an economic context, where price signals were a decentralized mechanism of bringing some rationality to how resources are allocated. And he understood those dynamics very well. Boyd is operating in military theater, right? So I think he was flying airplanes or something like that. But it doesn't matter where you are in the military, you don't have a price signal to respond to. So the OODA loop is this way of as the name suggests, observing, orienting, deciding, and action, isn't it? In that context, based on the information you have. With a price system, with a price, you have I don't want it that bad, or I don't need it that bad. And you make a binary decision about whether to buy or not. And that aggregates and sends a signal to the rest of the economy. It's like, okay, we may need to bring this price down. People are making the no decision on this. For Boyd, it is a complicated state of affairs. No, 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 no. The plane he was flying was complicated, but the environment in which he's functioning is complex. And so it's about moment to moment trying to go through a process of regarding your milieu, your environment around you, and making the best possible rational assessment, which might be like quick Bayesianism, or it might be something else. But the OODA construct is really meant to
Add something to this real fast. It's autonomous, right? You have agency in doing this. That's critical. Yes.
Yeah, I don't think orientation would negate pricing either, because that's something that would be weighed in a decision. Like it would weigh out, the mismatch, the
I
environment.
definitely think OODA belongs in an economic environment.
Well, he was an economist. Like
Yeah.
his original degree was in economics. Ponch's degree is in economics. My master's in economics. So like it is interesting, and he did study quite a bit of it. The one thing that really pisses me off about Boyd, when you go through the thousands of books that he read, you look at the list, it's hard to imagine that he didn't it's hard to imagine that he didn't read Mises, because he kind of bracketed all around Mises. And I always wonder in how I drew the original connection with Mises and Boyd was from the praxeological axiom, which really Mises is just describing John Boyd's OODA loop sketch.
Yeah, that's great. Okay.
And to your
Makes
point
a lot
about
of sense.
pricing too, is like we scan the environment and we get signals. And what Frank was talking about when we had him on, Frank Shostak was talking about, was that our because of monetary inflation, the price signals are all being distorted. So in our orientation, we're weighing and considering things that aren't necessarily matching up to reality. So that mismatch is diverting us. That's why we buy a house in the year 2004 for 250,000 and then sell it in 2006 for 500,000.
Yeah,
I've got something for you.
we're based so much more of the economy is based on a lie.
Yeah.
And if it's not truth conducive, that's going to start to manifest itself. The lie is going to be laid bare.
And the medium is the message. That's where the McLuhan comes in, because that environment is overriding your system and you're functioning and you're operating. And that is if that's reality, and it's not.
So I got something for you here. And this connects back to what Max is talking about. And we're talking about agency and the OODA loop in the context of healthcare. So ACA to me is a centralized approach it's a command and control approach to healthcare, right? It's socialism. And
it has a little bit of market features in it and arbitrage opportunity, but so little that it's negligible.
Right. So we're not flying our own airplane in that context. We are being driven by ground control intercept or ground control, right? They're telling us where to go, right? You got to go over here. You got to do that. You got to do that. What we need is some autonomy, more autonomy, I think. And that's how I'm kind of seeing this, is that OODA loop that we were talking about. In a free market, you have some agency. In communism, we've had Bijan on here to talk about this too.
Really, Adrian Bijan?
Oh yeah.
Oh, that's so great, man! I got to go look at that one.
He's a stud.
Yeah, he's coming back on in a few months after his new book comes out, so looking forward to that. But the whole point of his constructal law is about designing currency, which I think is really applicable to what we're talking about today too, and the way we look at John Boyd OODA loop. And it's really about that design of the system. The system drives behaviors, right? The big D being design. Yeah. It's not a verb. Kind of getting off track here, but when we look at a command and control approach, which again kind of looks like socialism to me, or communism, that moves away, that reduces the agency that we have as individuals, right? And right. That's opposite of what we're trying to profess here on No Way Out, right?
And we lose the invisible hand thing. Invisible hand metaphor from Adam Smith is really all pervasive in the Austrian economics tradition, which means that there is, for lack of a better way of putting it, a greater overall good that results from individual truth conducive decision making in real time.
That's
But
self-organization, right?
the easiest way to describe this in the context of healthcare is to go back to your examples of complicated and complex. The Great Barrier Reef is complex. That's a complex system, or the Amazon rainforest. And there's this subdiscipline of metaphysics called mereology, which is the relationships between wholes and parts. But we know what a system is, and we know systems can be bounded. The Great Barrier Reef is a bounded system of highly complex interactions among and self-organizing system among life forms. We know that intuitively, right? We also know that a 747 is a different sort of thing. That is something whose causal nexuses we can observe and plan and detail in our engineering, right? So we know essentially all of there are probably some microprocesses that cause it to deteriorate in time and stuff like that, but we have a pretty good grasp of that. So that the engineers at Boeing more or less understand how all of the parts interact with each other to give rise to getting people safely across the country on Delta or whatever. The problem with our healthcare system and our high modernists in Washington who they 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 see the world as we've just got to they're trying to put their mitts into an economy that is more like a Great Barrier Reef, but treating it like a 747, and they're two different things, and that's why everything fucks up.
That is
That's
gold.
they see it as an engine that can be engineered or a machine that can be run by circular flow, whereas Hayek and Boyd and others that understand that all action is human action and the economy is actually an organic function. A market is a natural process. The Federal Reserve does not occur in nature. The S&P 500 does not occur in nature, but people exchanging for one condition and trade off for another, that does exist in nature. And that's what real economics that's what economics is. It goes back to where, we're talking about housing, and anybody's seen The Big Short. All these people are oriented to something which they think is real, but it's not, because their signals that they're receiving are distorted by the inflation or the preference that one industry or sector got over the other, or withheld information or whatever it was. What they were weighing in for their own judgment was disconnected from reality. These were not AAA rated securities. These were actually a bunch of people not paying their mortgage, and they could hide it under things. And you realize that sort of synthetic collusion does not occur in nature. It doesn't. That's not how that's how corporatism works. That's how mercantilism works. That's how Keynesianism works. That's how socialism works. But capitalism, small c, not the big C distortion of the definition, is nothing more than two people exchanging one set of circumstances for the other. We're trading
And
right now. We're
aggregating
trading
this
time.
to millions and billions. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're constantly doing it, and this is what we tell about OODA. You're constantly the process is this never stops, right? We're constantly economizing. Right now we're trading time. We're sharing time with each other. We're trading alternatives that we could have been doing other things, and here we are. Like you're constantly doing that. But if it had been
And
under the
the central
auspices of
planners,
like,
they say, we don't care about your opportunity cost.
yeah, yeah,
Like, we're going to spend this for you. You're welcome.
basically you're going to have your orientation rewritten by somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that orientation is almost always false relative to people at the periphery at their periphery. In other words, us. It's almost always creates falsehood and distortion. And it layers it because invariably they go back and try to fix their mistakes with other mistakes. And you get just a layering of mistakes on and on and on. And welcome to the Federal Reserve. Welcome to Congress. It's a shit show.
One
And all of
example,
and
just
and Hayek and so on. And in Bijan, if I don't, maybe I'll leave Bijan because people might not know what the constructal law is and how vascularization happens. But the simple way of saying it is, if you can imagine any kind of vascular system, whether it's the blood flow through our body, the river basin, or any other system of natural flow, when central authorities come along, they think that they can do it better than it organically occurs. That's when you run into problems.
Yeah.
Now we bring in, now it's even more Boyd and Hayek, right? The pretense of knowledge. Now we think that like we're in DC and we're smart guys, and Ponch represents Colorado and Max represents North Carolina and Mark represents Pennsylvania, and we can all gather together in Washington and we can figure out everybody in all 50 states. We can figure all these things out for you as if we could see the information ourselves, as if we have any idea.
There's another layer to that, Mark. The system that's driving the behaviors in DC too, right? They're not just going up there with our interest in mind,
Right. They have their
right?
own
It's not,
selfish interests.
and that's not because they're naturally evil. It's probably because the system is driving them towards
It's
the.
Well,
they have the same selfish instincts that we have, but they're in an incentive system that provides different rewards and punishments than the one we operate in.
Right.
the Facebook movie, whatever, what was it called? Social Network. Larry Summers was portrayed in that movie. I bet you the next movie about Larry Summers is going to be really different than, right? Because these systems that drive behaviors, But just as an example, he probably went into things with the best intentions, right? He probably, he's a guy behind the scenes, but these people are, no one's exempt from what Mises is describing. No one's exempt from OODA. No one's exempt from what Hayek is talking about. They're describing what actually happens in universal reality, not the Keynesian 45-degree angle thing. I mean, that's all smoke and mirrors, horseshit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. The other interesting sort of companion to the Austrians, I think, is the public choice school. I don't know if you guys have gotten into public choice theory.
A little bit
But
like the George Mason crowd, like
yeah,
Buchanan and others.
Buchanan and Tulloch. Also,
I know the
they're
purists will argue, like, well, they're not really Austrians, or they're not really.
yeah, but who cares?
There's
They
still
have great
value.
insight. Yeah,
Yeah.
of course. It's like to me, they work in beautiful tandem. The public choice theorists is even like Mansur Olson, who was considered a man of the left. He saw the dynamics of decline, speaking of, as being more or less a process of concentrated benefits, dispersed costs. If you can create a situation where concentrated benefits, namely special interests or favor seekers in Washington, have a strong incentive to benefit, and it's a fraction of a penny's cost to you and me to understand how they're benefiting at our expense, we don't have the inclination or the knowledge, the incentive, anything to push back against that. It's like sometimes I use the example of a mohair subsidy. And first thing people say is, "What the hell's mohair?" I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, there's a kind of
It's in
goat."
Benny and the Jets, the mohair or suit.
Yeah, yeah. It's like it's a fabric. It's a kind of wool that they used in the war, in Second World War, and they subsidized mohair so that soldiers could have warm coats. Well, it's never stopped being subsidized. It's like we're not, trudging through France on the way to Germany now, right? With our military. So why is it that we're subsidizing mohair? It doesn't make any sense. But you don't know what mohair is, much less that there's a subsidy on it. And so there are a million stories like this as these favor seekers accrete around Washington, and they contribute to our $38 trillion debt because everybody's got their hand in the till or their snout in the trough.
Anybody care to guess why your Coca-Cola has high fructose corn syrup in it and not sugar?
That's right.
I mean, it's the same.
Got those corn growers out there in Iowa who they really love the idea because and Iowa's always first to vote, so very powerful agricultural lobby, love to grow that corn, turn it into syrup and stick it in your Coke, even
Yeah.
though it's not as good as sugar.
Yep. Making you sick. And also too, the sugar tariffs that we've had for years that make things anti-competitive. I mean, we're not, for the most capitalist country in the world, so called. I mean, we certainly do. We have a penchant for protectionism.
It's true, and it used to be when I was coming up, it used to be that was sort of a leftish thing.
Yeah.
They didn't like that we were, it's like I was opposed to agricultural subsidies, not just because I don't want to have to pay artificially high prices to prop up some domestic industry. Um, I I also have a lot of compassion for the poorest people in the world, where architecture is the first rung on their ladder to prosperity. And
Mm,
if we can't trade with them, then those are foreclosed opportunities for them. Now, I have softened a little bit, I admit, to the idea of tariffs. If I thought that going into tariff conflict the way that the Trump administration has is more likely to get reciprocity in trade, where countries that would have levied big tariffs on our goods would back off of it a little bit. If you use it in that way to get to a free trade kind of overall in the world, that's fine. And if you want reciprocal tariffs on a country that has them on you, I understand that, even though we have to pay the bill. And I understand the desire to reconstitute certain industries on these shores so that we don't get caught with our pants down, where other factors that are not economic, that are geopolitical, could really get us. I understand that impulse too, but tariffs for the sake of tariffs, tariffs on top of, income tax and corporate tax and sales tax. I mean, it's just too much.
yeah.
So I know
They
that the
start
idea.
wars sometimes.
That's
Sometimes
right.
where you're sitting in South Carolina, sometimes tariffs cause people to fire cannons at tariff collection points in the harbor.
Hmm.
And why? Because people wind up paying more for the goods and services that are staple to them. They end up paying a lot more.
Moose, you just described a kinetic war, though.
Well, sometimes a fifth
They
generation
lead to
war or
kinetic
like
war.
a narrative
Yeah.
war turns into a kinetic war really quick. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
but we're already at war. I mean, people don't
Well,
understand
that's
that.
true. Yeah, tariffs. Look at our article on Substack. Yeah, tariffs are narrative weapons. I mean, that's the side that everybody kind of forgot. Um, back to unrestricted warfare. I mean, it says in there we're going to use tariffs. We're not gonna fight them in the sea. We're going to use tariffs.
Yeah, I have a lot of mixed feelings on it. I'm curious to know what you guys want. I know I'm not conducting this interview, and I appreciate
Nah, it's
it.
conversation.
Yeah,
No,
yeah, I
no way out.
appreciate
It's a
letting me ask.
conversation placing.
What do you think about China and what to do about China? Knowing that China's asking the same question about us. We've had some imperial ambitions. We had a nice after the fall of communism in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, we had pretty good stretch of Pax Americana with, globalization, protecting the sea lanes, where our military was just, designed to sort of help lower trade barriers. We had some of the GATT treaty and so on that help the world start to trade with each other more, so you get the gains from trade. But a lot of people see this, and there's a conflation, of course, between globalism and globalization. And a lot of people don't like both, especially these days. The America First crowd likes neither. They like neither globalization nor globalism. I don't like globalism, which is the centralization of authority around the globe into these multilateral institutions like the UN or the or European Union, because they're unaccountable, they're undemocratic. And I'm not even a fan of democracy, but that's bad, the way these are starting to function.
Yeah.
And I don't want to see more of that centralization. And I'm sure you guys don't either. But the issue with China, with their way of looking, the CCP, their way of looking at the world, their fusion of capitalism and socialism into state capitalism or fascism, their imperial ambitions are, they are more driven by resources and making sure that they can have, the Belt and Road Initiative is more about resources, but they still have aspirations to gobble up Taiwan, for example. And so it's like, okay, we're the main subsidizers of their vast military and its ambitions. Do we want to do that anymore? And does that overcome our sense of peace through from trade?
Yeah. Well, Ponch and I are both veterans of guarding the sea lanes. I'm a charter member of the South China Sea Yacht Club, deployed down in those areas that are hot, around like Philippines and where there's island claims. And I was stationed in Okinawa, which is right there, smack in the middle of it. I think there's when you say, what do we do about China? I mean, that's extremely aggregate. thing to think of China. I mean, I have to define China. I have to define, Chinese. There is the CCP. There's also the companies that are quote unquote private that are also run by the CCP. China's, I think, is the only place where you could be the CEO of a public company, but also a general in the military, right? So there's a lot
Didn't
of
know that.
nuance around China. It's interesting to me about China is I don't believe that they seek global hegemony of the way, hate to say the way we do, but I don't think they want to conquer. I don't think they want to make the United States of China on these shores. I don't think they want to subjugate and put settlers all over, and colonies. I don't think they want to turn us into colonies per se. I think that China, at their word, when I look at things like unrestricted warfare, which is something that Franzo Singa, who is Boyd's scholar, talk about, you know, they are going to increase their power and their position through non-traditional means, lawfare, currency war, fentanyl, media, any number of areas. And we've talked about that a lot. Ponch and I talk about that a lot. We've talked about that a lot with John Robb, Bill DeMarco, and others. I think that China, at some point, you do take them at their word. They want to trade with people, right? So Belt and Road Initiative, they have, to my understanding, China actually has more icebreakers than the United States does, and they're creating another route in the Arctic Sea with the Russians. Taiwan, they view Taiwan like we view Puerto Rico or Cuba. I mean, they think it's theirs. It's off their shore. They have a completely different perspective of Taiwan than we do. Which, if you go back and you study that of the nationalists versus the communists in the leading up to the Second World War, and the war with Japan, there's a lot more nuance to that than just like the commies versus the Democratic Republic. There's a lot more complexity on those things. And
It was like the Red Army and the White Army, and the White Army went
yeah,
to Formosa,
yeah,
and
they were,
that's the sort of short story that we all get, and it's just like Chiang Kai-shek was
yeah,
the
Chiang
leader of.
Kai-shek. Yep.
Yeah,
His
and
wife
he
is
went
buried
to.
here in New York, here in Westchester County.
Wow, interesting,
because
okay.
because of the tensions. Like that, there's a reason for that. So she was over here, she lived, but not to get on that rabbit hole, but if you read China Mirage by James Bradley, that wrote the book Flags of Our Fathers, and the one about the raid on Aishima, which the only survivor was Vice President George Bush. I think it's called Flyboys.
Yeah.
He was completely outcast from the book circuit after writing China Mirage, and the other one he wrote was The Imperial Cruise. And what he set himself on a mission to understand, well, why did my dad have to go to Iwo Jima in the first place? So he goes on this whole historical rabbit hole, and he learns about the Opium Wars, and he learns about the how most of the massive American families, like the Delanos and others, and the Roosevelts and the Forbes and the all these Rockefellers was oil, but a lot of these other families were in what's called the China trade, which was basically selling opium into China, which was a threat under the punishment of death. But there were two opium wars, with the United Kingdom, and China believes they call that their century of great humiliation.
Yeah.
Ponch and I both come from the naval services. I'm a Marine in Ponch's Navy, but there was a thing called China Marines. Well, what were China Marines? China Marines were stationed and based in Shanghai. There was also the Yangtze River Patrol. I mean, we basically ran China. Like we were intervening and controlling China up until the Second World War, and that's not really that long ago. So, like when we think of China in like their current form of what they are, that's all evolved from after the Second World War, accelerated by Nixon's opening China, and then I think it was Carter where they recognized China as the permanent member of the UN and not the Republic of China, which we now know as Taiwan. There's so much nuance and complexity to that thing. It's really hard to just say China.
No, and I apologize for the brief hypostatization of just saying China. There is a whole set of phenomena there that cause people unease.
Yeah.
Whether that is there's individual, or I guess you call them discrete problems that are connected to other surrounding problems and issues. But for example, I think we only recently have come across some of the rare earth minerals that we need to manufacture chips, chipsets, guts of phones, things like that. And China really does have the market cornered on a lot of these things. And by China, I mean the CCP.
Yeah.
Um, that's unless you innovate your way out of the need for rare earth metals and in those sets, then you're going to be at some sort of technical disadvantage eventually. There's also the issue of the export-led growth that China has maintained, which is basically they
Qualify that though, because where I would add to that very growth that you're talking about, they've decided to go into places that we would never go, and they go in with commerce versus drones and special operations forces. So when they go into
yeah,
African countries, they say, "Hey,
we're going to
we're
do
going to
good
build
things
you."
for you.
Yeah, we're going to build you ports and bridges and roads and railroads and da da da. And they're like, well, hold on, we're a Islamic theocracy, or hold on, we're a democracy, or hold on. And China's like, we don't give a shit because we just want to trade with you and have your cobalt. They also lost a labor advantage too, because some say that, their demographic pyramid is a disaster. Some also say that their population numbers are dramatically overinflated, and the manufacturing in China, it's actually cheaper now to go to Africa or South America. So even China has been doing a lot of like their
Or not.
outsourcing.
Yeah.
Yeah, Vietnam. I think too, like there's different points that you could point to. Like when we were kids, so we're back to being Gen X. Do you remember like having like a Matchbox car and it said like made in Macau, and you're like, oh, holy shit, where's Macau? Well, Macau is like is a Portuguese colony on mainland China, or like made in Hong Kong. Like, holy shit, made in Hong Kong. Well, what was Hong Kong? As a British protectorate inside of China. Those things are gone, and then China got most favored nation status.
Yeah.
Everything that my children had growing up as kids, it's all from China, 100%.
I think
Yeah.
there's a solid connection back
Exactly.
to the healthcare conversation, and that has to go with complex adaptive systems. So
Yeah.
going back to the threshold liminal space between overt and covert. Mark brought up several points with fentanyl. I don't think we talked about IP theft and things like that. So Cynic always starts with, start with why, then the how and the what. I'm the other way. When we do a debrief, you start with the what. What's actually happening, what happened, start there. And that's how I believe the best way to do a debrief, to look at what's going on and create that situational awareness, is what's actually happening. We have a fentanyl crisis, IP theft. We have students in the US that are, from China. Is that right or wrong? I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's what's happening, So that
My
IP
grad
theft,
school cohort, my grad school class was at a Catholic school, was more than half for a degree in economics. More than half of us were from mainland China.
Okay.
yeah. So then you get down to the how and you get down to the why. The why is that unrestricted warfare. And I think that's what, that fifth generation warfare is happening. We are at war and American people don't know that. We are getting our asses kicked at the moment. The same problem in understanding what's going on with China is the same problem with trying to understand what's going on in healthcare. It's a complex system. We have to understand that complexity. And I think that's what you're doing a great job with, Max, in your book, your latest book anyway, on the singularity, because you write about a lot of these things in there with liminal, not, I don't think you have liminal warfare in there at all, but you do have emergence and, again, complex adaptive systems and things like that. So, yeah, guys, I'm a huge believer that it's an education problem here in the US. We just do not understand
Cultural. It's a cultural
the
problem.
culture too. Yeah. Yeah. So it's
Yeah.
orientation, right, Moose?
Yeah, I mean, because like we had our founding strategist brief today with Lieutenant Colonel Assad Khan, who's been a guest on our podcast, whose book Betrayal of Command, and the whole entire point was, one of his big things was cultural. Like in America, we don't get the cultural perspectives of all these places that we intervene. Now, here's a guy, his family hails from the borderlands of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and he speaks all the languages. His uncles were like high-ranking military officers in Pakistan. He's telling them, we can't do that, and here's why. It's because we just have this cultural disconnect, because everything to us matters in like a 24-hour news cycle, or what we think we saw on TV.
That is another that is another our conception of time really does lead to our eventual decline.
Yeah, tell us more about that, because we don't disagree.
It's the short-sightedness phenomenon. So many examples, but one example is there's a slowness to an election cycle. So let's call it time distortions, because There are certain things that cause us to make rash decisions before, for example, the next election cycle. And when I say us, I mean the political class. I don't mean you and me, because obviously we're not making these decisions. In representative government, they purport to do it on our behalf. When a president makes a certain kind of decision for foreign policy, Chinese person in the Chinese Communist Party, who's, unless they screw up and are perceived as traitors in some way, they might be lifers. Okay. And a lifer in the Chinese Communist Party thinks in terms of not 2 years, but 20 years and 50 years.
Yep.
There is something about a governance apparatus that is centralized that at the very least has the ability to think through the long term in time. Now, there are problems with this for very Hayekian reasons that you guys and I would appreciate, which is it's extremely difficult to plan anything over those timescales. The Soviets had 5-year plans and they always came up short because they ran squarely into the socialist calculation problem, for example.
Which is a price. That's a misunderstanding of not having when you don't have a price system.
That's right. That's right. So we can go back to that. And certainly the Chinese, to the extent that they are using technocratic means, are going to run afoul of those kind of phenomena, whether it's a socialist calculation problem or just generalized problem of rationalistic planning through time. But
just to sum up for our listeners, the socialist calculation debate was something that Ludwig von Mises talked about in saying that within socialism, why it would always fail is because there is no incentive-based pricing system. No one can act in their own accord in a marketplace. So that's why there's long lines at the DMV. And that's why, there's
or get an MRI in Canada.
Right. Yep.
And increasingly here, our wait times are being distorted here too now, and that's starting to, for the longest time we were expensive, but at least we were fast.
Yeah,
that's starting to.
That's going away. Anyway, I just had to throw that in there just so people could have the.
But in terms of governance, and I will admit that to being what you might call an asymptotic anarchist, like I want to get closer and closer to a stateless society through time, because I believe that will mitigate or reduce the amount of violence in the world of one person against another and create a more and more collaborative state of affairs. But I'm under no illusions about how difficult that is and how other people just don't live in that idealistic universe. So I think of it as, okay, not how do we go, not looking at Z and going, Z is wonderful, Z's paradise, we need to implement Z tomorrow. It's how do we go from A to B, then B to C, and so on. The thing about governance in countries that have what we might call benevolent dictatorships or even not so benevolent dictatorships is that they can take a long view. If you're going to be out in 3 more years as a President Trump, whatever you have done can be pulled apart and they can return to a status quo ante, or they can change everything up otherwise and implement a new state of affairs for the system. So it's not just that some of these other societies can think about a long game. It's that they can't expect us to play a long game with them because of the zigzag of politics in this country makes it so that we're never dependable. We're not stable through time. They view us as instability, both in as inherently unstable, both in our domestic politics and in our international relations.
There's nothing wrong with there's nothing wrong with that. It actually creates more mismatches for them to deal with.
From our perspective, that might actually be, the element of surprise or whatever. Or it's just, it's not even an element of surprise. It's just like, you kind of always have to keep an eye on them because they're crazy town, right? It doesn't figure into any kind of, what is it called? Rational game theoretical matrix. It's always like, it just seems kind of random. Increasingly that's the case, especially as we're starting to understand what Trumpism is and what it means. And he even throws us curves from time to time in a sort of self-contradictory way. It's very different from all of the administrations that came before, which still had their own surprises, twists and turns, and so on. So I don't know. I have mixed feelings about this, as I'm sure you guys do. It's like, in some
Yeah.
sense, it benefits us. In some sense, it doesn't.
Well, that's all isn't that always the case about any political program is there's the ones the favored and the unfavored. I'm of the belief there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, you know, and I think that that's really one of the fatal flaws of America is we don't have a appreciation for history or context or philosophy. We don't teach logic anymore. You know, my oldest child was 22. My youngest child is 17, right? None of them were born. They don't know what 9/11. You know, they know what 9/11 is, but they didn't live through it. They don't know what an encyclopedia set is, other than they could Google it and look at something like nostalgic, making fun of it. The point is that their perspective as we advance in technology and our politics are the way they are. I just feel like you're right. There is a massive distortion of how we view time. Whereas we look at even countries like China, that's run by a communist dictatorship. It's still an ancient culture that's preceded us by thousands and thousands of years. That has maybe like what Mises would call the regression theorem, right? We still think back to a gold standard, even though there is no. Then they still think back to those ancient things that have been around
Yeah,
culturally a long
I
time.
think the way the CCP operates is still very much a species of Confucianism, and I personally don't admire it very much, but we've already forgotten where we came from as Jeffersonians. Makes me sick.
Yeah.
We have no identity anymore as Americans. It's just
Well, you get to pick your pronouns, right?
sorry?
I just said you get to pick your pronoun. You can do whatever you
Yeah,
want.
yeah, yeah, I do. I get to pick my pronouns. Woohoo!
Well,
But, like,
remember this too, that a great many Americans didn't even side with the quote unquote rebellion when that happened.
yeah.
And the great many didn't agree with independence. A great many didn't agree with the Constitution. And I've
Right,
always
there were
found,
Tories.
yeah, there were Tories, but then there were also anti-federalists, there was Patrick Henry and George Mason and others.
I am an anti-federalist.
I mean, when you read the Anti-Federalist Papers, you would think that they had access to time travel and that they went back in time
Damn
to
right.
tell everybody what happened. I'd written an article back in May on Substack
The
about the
same.
100th anniversary of Malcolm X's birth. Malcolm X is another one that, like, you would think that he had access to time travel because he's pretty clear about what's going to happen, and sure as shit, it all happened. I also think too, when we reduce people to memes, so Patrick Henry is reduced to, the guy that said give me liberty and give me death. That's it. Read what he wrote. Read what Patrick Henry wrote. Go find Patrick Henry's papers. Holy shit! I mean, that guy. You would think that
He
he
was a
went to
radical.
yeah, but that he went to 2025 and went back in time to tell everybody, hey, here's what's going to happen if we.
I think the most profound time travel-y one is, Robert Yates, which was, Robert Yates was, Brutus in
In the Federalist
the
Papers.
Federalist Papers. His pseudonym was Brutus. Yeah, I'm just reading this stuff going, "My God," and, in the meantime, they're doing Hamilton stage shows in New York, and
Yeah.
he's the devil.
Yeah, it's funny. Isn't it funny how they have to rehab a guy they keep doing all these years later to protect the reputation of a guy like Hamilton and to not like a John C. Calhoun, like they'll take his name off of a college in Yale and they'll just because he was a slave owner, he was a racist and leave it at that. But then like you read his discourse on his political discourse. I think that's what people are upset about, not that the fact that he was racist or owned slaves, which he was. I mean, he was a slave owner and certainly had an opinion that would not be commensurate with our own times. But when you see these people get uh, when you see these thinkers get reduced, it does pique curiosity. It was like, what were they really saying? Like, again, I'll just use Patrick Henry as an example. Or, John Robb talks a lot about Washington's farewell address. He talks about that all the time. How far
Yeah,
we've deviated from that.
yeah,
But
yeah,
then
it was,
Washington owned slaves and he was a racist. Well, that's true. And the Washington's farewell address, if not adhered to, I don't see why anybody would be surprised at any of the outcomes.
To me, it's sort of like, Martin Luther King was a socialist and he was running trains with all of these women and his buddies, and he's supposed to be a preacher. Yeah, people are sinners,
Yep.
but
For fun.
man did a lot of good things too. Let's
Yeah.
look at all of it, but let's not fail to point out the wonderful things. You know,
John F.
in some
Kennedy's another one of those because growing
That's
up,
right.
think about when we were kids as Gen Xers, he was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald. That's the end of it. And on the
Mhm.
left, he's like this icon. And on the right, he's this womanizing skirt chaser that was a Harvard playboy, right? But
Who at least reduce taxes.
But then when you start digging and you're like, holy shit, there's a lot more to John F. Kennedy that nobody even knew about. And I think really where I would bring all this to, because, we tell people all the time, and I wrote an article about this called The Candle in the Silence. You know, the more I get into Boyd, McLuhan, Hayek, Mises, all these things, the more I realize that I want to be an observer versus a participant. I don't want to lose my observation status. I want to be able to look at these things and not get boxed into a tribe. I had one out the other week about like how we get oriented into red team versus blue team in politics, but it's all being like there was an AI rendering I did with it, but it's basically all the same corporate overlords pumping the same thing into both sides, just putting a different label on it. But I find that the more into it, the more I get that you become more apolitical, maybe like not boxed into any one party, because like Boyd would say, or McLuhan would say, and even Hayek, because remember, Hayek was a socialist until Mises showed him that the error of it. You got to be able to let go and move on, because we don't know. Knowledge is tacit and dispersed, and we're always learning, and things are always changing. And there's what's real and aligned with reality, and then there's what's synthetic and oriented for you, such that it would put you
Mhm.
into a box to get you to do something that you didn't otherwise want to do.
This is a really interesting turn, if you'll allow me to follow it, is you've opened the door to something interesting here.
Hit me.
The first is that you say, I want to be more of an observer. And what Boyd does, I think when you have people who use an OODA kind of sensibility about the world on a continuous basis, they're going to be less tribal. But what's interesting is, and I see you to the best of your ability doing this. When I mentioned China and the dynamics of China and its deep history and so on, you went down the road of talking about its history and the perspective of the Chinese, their incentives, and it was really interesting. It might be to someone who thinks, it's USA versus CCP, that kind of narrow thinking ends up making us less formidable in terms of even if they turn out to be our enemy rather than a cooperator or collaborator in certain respects, knowing either way, you want to better understand them. So is it appropriate to, in the interests of improving collective intelligence, and by collective intelligence, I mean it in both a narrow and wide sense. In the narrow sense, it's what do I know and you know together that happens to be more true, right, than just something I would know by myself.
Hmm.
But that verisimilitude, that tendency towards truth, is what we're going through from two different perspectives. I guess this is a long-winded way of putting. Can you attempt to take on the perspective of another in a more empathic way, say, even though you're not literally orienting yourself in OODA fashion a la Boyd in some environment? Can you use a Boyd sensibility to try to understand other people and
He
other
would tell
perspectives?
us that. I think that he would tell us that. I think that that's exactly the whole point of studying Boyd and OODA, is to be able to take someone else's perspective and understand something and see something that they didn't see and they weren't capable of seeing. So I think that following Boyd is exactly what would make someone have the desire to try to understand someone else's perspective, just to see why they're making the decisions that they're making, why they're sensing the world the way that they're sensing, why they make the decisions they make, why they act the way they do, why they learn the way they do. I think that's the charge, which, by the way, is also too why he never would put everything in writing. It was all briefing decks and oral culture, because he could be wrong. He was afraid of being wrong, and a lot of the being wrong came from gathering other perspectives that he didn't have previously. I mean, what would you say, Ponch? I mean, I feel like that's sort of the imperative, one of the imperatives of the human aspects of Boyd, and McLuhan and others, is that it's almost like a mandate for empathy and, doing to others what you would do unto yourself, doing unto others as you would have done unto you.
Yeah, so I just glanced over at a book here from Angus Fletcher, Primal Intelligence, and in it he writes about eat your enemy, right? So looking at how operators understand their enemies, understand your enemy. That's understand your competition. So some Sun Tzu and Clausewitz in there. That's essential. So you have to take that perspective. It could be empathy, however you want to look at it. But one thing I did want to bring back us to before we depart here, make sure I bring the right one up, is this is from Anatomy of a Decline by Chuck Spinney, right? And in it has two key points in the middle. I'll read them out. For adaptation, individual groups need to change their internal structure, their orientation, if you will, to cope with the challenges and constraints of the environment. This is how you win, right? This is how you win. Trying to change the environment to meet the needs of your internal structure or your internal orientation, it's impossible, right? It's a good way to lose. Let me rephrase that. I'm going back to where we started earlier. When we bring up woke, and I know a lot of people don't like the different connotations of woke, but the way I look at wokeism and being woke is it's the second one, trying to change the environment to meet the needs of your internal structure or your orientation. You're trying to project something onto us that isn't quite actionable at the moment. It's not to say you shouldn't do that. It's just you should do it lightly with probes, not go full out. And there are many companies that went hard on this in the last 4 or 5 years to match their internal environment.
That's really interesting. I like that.
I'll send this to you. Moose has it too.
I mean,
it's great.
This is, one area that we've danced around, and it's something that I've studied a shit ton, and I have a lot of books on it, is about mass psychology too. And that's another thing that we're all susceptible to. And mass psychology is why someone would say to somebody, if you said to me, I homeschool my children, I would say, well, what are you going to do about socialization? And the reason I would say that is because the mass psychology has massaged it into my orientation to reflexively say, when you say you homeschool your children, for me to think that that's weird and, what do you do about socialization? Mass psychology is what makes people buy houses in 2022 or 2002, thinking that they're going to be the price just goes up. Mass psychology is tapped into all the time in your political programs. And it goes back to the reason why I choose the observer path over the participant path because of that. And I try to call that out as much as I can see it, that people get caught up in these moments of mobs and mass movements and political programs. Now, when I was a child, my dad was stationed in West Germany and we lived in Bavaria, and it was West Germany because there was no unified Germany at the time. And I remember we had a lady, Frau Berta, who cleaned our house and babysat us. And my mom asked her one time, how in the hell could a daily mass goer, she went to mass every single day, Frau Berta, how is it that people here in Bavaria, and this Catholic of all places, could be caught up in the Third Reich, and Nazism and all that? And she says what she said, she's long gone, but she said, well, when we were kids, we had turnips. But then when Hitler came to power, we had oranges, because people were mesmerized by mass movements, because they would think, well, there might be something happening, but I don't want to talk about that, or I don't want to look about that. And these things are important to study because they flip your orientation. They have a direct orientation. I mean, recently Dick Cheney was buried, and all of a sudden George W. Bush is being lionized. Well, I'm old enough to remember when the media, those same exact people, were calling George Bush Hitler, and George Bush was, remember, and George Bush was Hitler. He's the devil. He's destroying the country. He's invading countries. And then on January 20th, 2009, when he gave up power, all those things that he was doing were all of a sudden okay. Why? Well, because Obama was doing. And then for the people that like Bush, the same thing. Well, Obama's bad. He was doing this, doing that, and it's just the same thing. But all of that comes from mass psychology, from
I think the Cheney one is the funniest because the
yeah.
Cheneys
They thought he was Darth Vader. Like they thought he
he
was
was
like,
the absolute devil, and as
yeah,
soon as he came out saying that he couldn't stand Trump, all of a sudden
uh,
he was back in the club.
just like John McCain, just like all of
Yeah.
them. It's
Yeah,
but
but look, and look, I'm not
But
saying
I don't
people
have
should
to
like
take a
Trump
side.
either. I'm just
But,
saying
like,
it's
yeah,
like
we're not saying that. That's right. What
yeah.
I'm saying is that when you understand what Boyd, McLuhan, Mises, Hayek, Teilhard de Chardin, what they're talking about, and then, like, the whole mass psychology library, that's Bernays and Gustave Le Bon and Humphrey B. Neal and what's his name that wrote Public Opinion? Walter Lippmann. When you start to understand those things, you begin to look at, again, these are gaining perspectives, to your point, taking empathy and understanding. When you start to see those things, you start to realize what's actually going on, and it's likely not what you're reading in the news.
Well, and this is maybe if you'll permit me to sort of land the plane here on my end. I know you guys have time is
Yeah,
of
go
the
ahead.
essence, and we got to wrap up, but I had sort of mentioned to you at the beginning of the show that I have become more interested in how to pass the torch, wisdom's torch to a younger generation, right? And I'm sitting here talking to some really, really fascinating guys who are my age, and yet I want to start to get the kind of things that we're talking about into subsequent generations, right? So that and it's not, maybe it doesn't need to be to the level of sophistication as Marshall McLuhan, John Boyd, and Friedrich Hayek, but there are some at least nuggets of wisdom and beginnings of heuristics for how to live better. And I think that starts with what's really troubled me about this generation of boys and girls has been our having, or at least this generation having permitted the removal of their internal locus of control. And what I mean by that is not just that they tell themselves the story that they don't have agency, it's that the world echoes that story, right?
Mass
So it's like,
psychology. Yeah.
yeah, so that they're more susceptible to mass psychology. And that's
Yeah.
exactly why I'm bringing it up. So it's like when you see everybody around you doing something stupid, ask yourself, can you take a moment to sit in the space a little bit and ask yourself whether you should be participating in that stupidity,
Yeah.
or if some kind of Swiss neutrality is better, or even to work at odds against it. Because if you don't, and that means sometimes if there's an egregore out there, right, that is amassing, and to use the language of mass psychology, where there's some evil phenomenon that has captured the minds of millions or the masses, you've got to learn to first find your own center and then ask yourself how to bring the wisdom and your perspective and understanding, and have that, in, sorry to say it, in mass psychological terms, form a counterpower or counterblock to that.
Mm.
Because so the long and short of it is I'm becoming increasingly persuaded that we have to engage in an intergenerational torch passing with particularly young men, because I'm a man, and women have always been a mystery to me in some sense, but certainly young women are a deep mystery wrapped inside a riddle, wrapped inside an enigma. And so I don't want to presume to be able to do that, but I will say that this next generation of young men, I think guys like us can and do have something to say to them,
Yeah.
and that they can benefit from, and it not come across as whatever, graybeard, right? And it's like, if the message is empowering, like that restoration of your internal locus of control, which is which is polished and not perfected, but it is certainly always improved by practicing the OODA orientation, right?
Yeah.
Then that they might actually come through this not as weak men who make bad times.
Well, there's the Fellowship of the Ring. It was only a handful, and like, two little hobbits that made it through. So there's certainly an allegory for us to think about these patterns that, again, I think they continue over history. I think, Max, I'm sure Ponch agrees with me. This is the first of many installments of the Gen X gathering of the minds.
Yes, sir. Yes, indeed. And I would love to have you guys, of course, on my show as well. So
Yep.
we can
Say
continue to
when.
play ping pong back and forth and have a good old time.
Absolutely, and we will certainly link to all your socials and Substacks and things, and get everybody over there. So, for the sake of recording, Max, thanks for joining us, and we will see you again soon.
Thanks for having me.